on Paris on Politics.
President Biden signs a sweeping immigration executive order for undocumented spouses. We get the lowdown from Congressman Chuy Garcia. Will former Alderman Ed Burke spend his remaining years in prison? We preview his prison sentencing slated to happen Monday. And will an 8 p.m. curfew make Streeterville safer? The sponsor of an ordinance fills us in. Paris on Politics is next.
This is Paris on Politics from Fox Chicago.
Thanks for joining us this evening. President Biden signs an executive order allowing certain undocumented spouses of American citizens to stay in the country as they await citizenship. For one local congresswoman, the move is more than political, it's personal.
These couples have been raising families, sending their kids to church and school, paying taxes, contributing to our country for 10 years or more.
Illinois Congresswoman Delia Ramirez praised the move, saying it provides relief for families like hers, whose spouses have lived in the shadows for fear of deportation.
There's this assumption, Paris, that if you marry a U.S. citizen, you automatically are able to qualify for legal permanent residency. And the reality is that's not true. We've been at it for about 3 years now and still waiting. This will allow us to be able to get more extended protections while we wait.
Ramirez and her husband Boris Hernandez were at the White House for today's announcement.
I'm excited for those that do not have the same resources we have. It will certainly facilitate the process for them.
Biden says this and an earlier executive order cracking down on asylum seekers at the border would have been moot had House Republicans not killed a bipartisan immigration package.
When Republicans walked away from the deal for the most pathetic and petty of reasons, Donald Trump got on the phone literally and started, and the press can confirm this, and calling senators saying don't.
Ramirez, critical of Biden for the border policy, says today's move is a first step to protecting residents already here, like her husband.
Someone that's been in this country since the age of 14 has spent his life contributing to community. It's nerve-wracking, which is exactly why today was so important.
And now to break it down, we're joined by another Illinois Congressman, Jesus Chuy Garcia of Chicago. Congressman Garcia, thanks so much for being here.
Glad to join you, Paris.
All right, so your reaction to Biden's executive order protecting nearly 500,000 undocumented spouses of citizens. As I understand, you were at his White House announcement yesterday.
An exciting day at the White House. Good news on the immigration front for a change. The best news in 12 years since President Obama declared executive action on DACA. This will help, it's estimated, about 500,000 people nationally. These are spouses, husbands, and wives of U.S. citizens. They have U.S.-born children. Some have served in the armed forces, but they haven't been able to apply for lawful permanent residency. This promises to give them an opportunity. And there's also a provision that will help young people who have the DACA status continue their efforts to become permanent residents, as well as to have work permits and to pursue their professional careers if they've graduated from certain colleges and universities.
And we know the process of obtaining a green card or citizenship for a spouse can take many, many years, where they might have to go back to their home country and be separated from their family. Chicago is a sanctuary city, Illinois is a sanctuary state. So will this have an effect on families here?
This will certainly have an effect. We've got about 70,000 DACA type of individuals who could benefit from this. That's the larger universe. And we have at least about 45,000 spouses who could also benefit. And this brings peace of mind. This ends the threat of deportation for people who've been living that way for such a long time. I wish the executive order would include more people and provide work permits for people that have been here 10, 20, 30, even 40 years. But it doesn't, but that's a fight to be had in the future. Speaking
of a fight to be had, there is kind of this fight among progressives and more centrists in the party over the president's immigration policy. You were critical of his executive order cracking down on asylum seekers. Does something like this help him with Latinos and progressives?
Yes, I criticized the first part of the first executive order because I think it goes contrary to American values and what set us apart in the world as a nation. This, I think, is good because it signals that immigration reform and change can happen. I'm hopeful that in the 119th Congress, we'll get back to seriousness. And if we survive as a democracy, I think there'll be more space and room for that bipartisan cooperation, and I'm hopeful that we can either change the rule or suspend it for immigration reform, the filibuster rule, and move ahead. The country cannot continue to thrive without immigrants. It needs to be orderly, that's reasonable, and we need more bipartisan cooperation.
And the president made the point that there was a bipartisan immigration package written by Republicans, and it was, according to him, Donald Trump who called up the House Speaker and said, put a lid on this because this will help Biden politically. So what you're saying is if Biden wins again, perhaps things could get done, and you're saying if Trump wins, maybe democracy won't survive.
That's exactly what I'm saying. The stakes are very high. That's why this election is so important. If we want our country to continue to thrive, we've got to be realistic about what's good for the economy, what's good for the society, and our needs as we age as a population.
I want to bring it back to Chicago. Speaking of disruption of the DNC, do you anticipate Texas Governor Greg Abbott ramping up his busloads of migrants from the border to kind of stir up trouble here, as everyone is kind of wondered if that's going to happen as things have calmed down a bit?
I think there will be those efforts. The fact that the numbers have decreased at the border and the crisis seems to have dissipated for a variety of reasons, that it will be harder for Greg Abbott to attempt to disrupt the convention. I have no doubt that he intends on doing that. Other governors from that part of the region, the border region as well, and of course, Florida's governor. But I think that things are looking pretty positive as logistics go. And I think agreeing to a expression for those who want to protest during the convention will also, I'm hopeful that a deal will be struck as well.
And bringing it back locally, Chicago Mayor Brandon Johnson has sort of enacted this 60-day eviction policy in migrant shelters. They had delayed it for a while, but now they are acting on it. The Latino caucus and city council called on him to stop that. Do you think that the mayor should stop evicting migrants from shelters? Is that the best place for them to stay if they don't have housing and work yet?
I've been a big advocate of housing and believe that housing is a human right. I think we ought to do everything possible to shelter people. I think the mayor is trying to send a message that housing isn't going to be around forever for those who have needed it thus far. I think he's urging them to become as independent as possible. We are working on trying to get as many work permits issued through community organizations to folks that have come to Chicago. But I also feel that the Latino caucus has pointed out that there is enough funding and resources to continue to provide housing. So I think they're trying to find a sweet spot in a tough situation. And of course, the city is strapped for funding, has been very generous, has continued the tradition of being a welcoming city, but it's a tough time.
It's a tough thing to wrangle for the mayor in this administration. Lastly, Congressman, I know you're a big jazz buff. We've talked about this. What are you listening to these days?
Oh, man, I can't get enough of Kurt Elling, Chicago's very own.
Chicago's very own.
I've been listening to a lot of big band jazz, both in the Latin genre, some of the classical groups. But I haven't been to any live concerts, so I'm hungry, I'm thirsty, and I'm yearning to fill my ears with good sounds.
You're going to have to get out to the Green Mill and some of those outdoor festivals.
Yes, and I haven't
summer.
even gotten out to Fitzgerald's, which is in my district. Inexcusable.
That's in your district,
yes,
in Berwyn.
in Berwyn.
Fitzgerald's.
That's
Plug
right.
for that place.
Yes.
An awesome place. All right, Congressman Garcia, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Paris.
Up next on Paris on Politics.
How long will former Alderman Ed Burke spend behind bars? We get a preview.
Everywhere you look, you have history of the Tribune.
Chicago's most unique skyscraper, restored and reimagined.
Ooh, behind the curtain.
During construction, countless time capsules were discovered,
Had a letter from the sports editor of the Chicago Tribune.
including the most significant relic from the biggest scandal in Chicago sports history. What other wonders does the tower hold? Streaming on your smart TV, only at Fox 32 on Fox Local. Search Fox Local on these streaming platforms. Download and watch today.
We're going to the Crown. Let's do it.
Powerful former Chicago Alderman Ed Burke meets his fate on Monday. Burke is slated to be sentenced for his conviction on racketeering and extortion charges. It caps a stunning downfall for one of the most colorful and controversial politicians in Chicago history. Dane Placco reports.
First up are the literally hundreds of letters of support Burke's defense team gave federal judge Virginia Kendall earlier this month. Those letters written by many high-profile political and community leaders, including Paul Vallis, former Chicago Police Superintendent Gary McCarthy, and former U.S. Attorney Dan Webb. 38th Ward Alderman Nicholas Spizzato wrote that Burke has, quote, helped countless people and organizations along the way, and that he is one of them.
So the letters will influence the judge to grant a lesser sentence for Alderman Burke than if he granted what the prosecution has asked for.
But will those letters work? Can they erase the impact of the shocking FBI wiretaps played at the trial? Many of those secretly recorded conversations were between Burke and another former alderman, Danny Solis.
While you're at it, recommend the good firm of Crafter and Burke to do the tax work.
All right, I certainly will.
And we can certainly talk about a marketing arrangement for you.
200 letters of support is impressive, but they haven't helped other convicted politicians.
In the past, when people like Governor Blagojevich or other powerful figures like Dan Rostenkowski had various similar pleas for reduced sentences, those weren't granted.
Those letters aren't the only factor that could have an impact on Burke's sentencing.
There is a Supreme Court decision that is pending, which would redefine the terms of corruption. It's a case out of Indiana.
That upcoming decision, expected any day now, is why Burke's original sentencing date was pushed back.
It'll be interesting to see what's going to happen. Judge Kendall is a very no-nonsense judge.
Former Chicago FBI agent Ross Rice has had a front row seat to many of Chicago's biggest political corruption cases. Of the 13 charges Burke was convicted on, Rice says the most serious is racketeering.
So in theory, she could sentence him to 20 years for each count and run them consecutively, which would be a life sentence. That's not going to happen.
Rice believes that won't happen because of Burke's age, 80, and his health. As for the High Court's upcoming decision on the corruption statute,
a best case scenario for the alderman, that would remove 2 counts from his conviction, but he still has a boatload of others, and they all carry that potential 20-year sentence.
Simpson believes Burke will likely see time behind bars because he was convicted on all but one of the federal charges filed against him, and says judges usually send public officials convicted of corruption to prison.
Yes, I think he will get prison time. I don't think he will get the prison time that, say, Governor Blagojevich got. It was quite clear that Blagojevich had no remorse. He would not admit that any crime had been committed.
Simpson also believes Judge Kendall will sentence Burke to less than the 10 years prosecutors are asking for. And while Burke may show remorse for his crimes and have hundreds of letters of support, in the end, it all comes down to this.
The judge will certainly consider all the letters, but in the end, the judge will be most bound by the jury's conviction.
Of course, Ed Burke was one of the most powerful aldermen in city council history, serving for more than 50 years, many as head of the finance committee, and always dressed immaculately. But the experts we talked to say there's a pretty good chance that Burke's going to be trading in those 3-piece suits for prison garb. At the Dirksen Federal Building, Dane Placco, Fox 32 Chicago.
And joining us to preview Burke's sentencing is former federal prosecutor Patrick Collins. Mr. Collins led the prosecution of former Governor George Ryan and is now partner at King & Spalding. Pat Collins, good to see you. Thanks for being here.
Sure, Paris.
So prosecutors, as you know, want 10 years for Burke, which would essentially, pending early release, keep him behind bars until he's 90. Do you think that's an appropriate sentence for his crimes?
Well, that's a tough question, Paris. There's 2 sides of this story, of course. You have these crimes from a man who's been around government forever. Now, putting the defense hat on, this is a time where the judge is supposed to sentence the person. And the defense, as you know, spent a lot of time in their submission talking about the many private acts of goodness and the many acts that Mr. Burke did.
There was a voluminous amount of letters on his behalf.
I've been doing this a long time. I've never seen hundreds of letters, from people at the lower end of the socioeconomic spectrum saying just how Mr. Burke anonymously, charitably did so many good works. And the judge is supposed to sentence not just the crime, but the man. And so you have to weigh all those things. It's a very tough thing for Judge Kendall to have to do here.
Judges always also want to see contrition when someone is convicted. Do you expect Burke to get up there and apologize for what he did?
If you look at his papers, I think it's very unlikely, Paris, that he's going to do that. Now, partially, he's got appeal rights, and you don't want to affect those appeal rights. But I also think in his DNA, he doesn't necessarily believe he did. And I do think that will be a very important issue. If there's lack of contrition, that will definitely hurt Mr. Burke at sentencing.
And Judge Kendall, is she likely to take all these letters and all these good deeds that he did into account in her sentencing?
Most certainly she will to some extent. I think in some respects you can overdo it because it becomes sort of overcompensation for the conduct. And I think Mr. Burke here, when you don't address the underlying conduct and then you say, other than that, I was a really good person, there's a disconnect, I think, at a sentencing hearing when that's your strategy.
You know, with all these corruption cases, prosecutors want to send the message that folks thinking about engaging in these activities in the future should think twice. I think that's the message you thought you were sending with George Ryan. Here we are all these years later. Will this case accomplish that? Will a tough sentencing accomplish that?
Gosh, Paris, it'd be hard to argue. You know, the issue that prosecutors talk about is deterrence, general deterrence, deterring others from doing it, and then individual deterrence. There's no issue. Mr. Burke's career is over, and so there's no individual deterrence issue. The question is general deterrence. And if you line up Ryan, Blagojevich on down the line, it's hard to argue that these sentences have deterred additional future conduct. But that is something the prosecutors talk a lot about in their papers, that judge send a message for the person next in line not to fall the ways that Mr. Burke fell.
Of course, defense is going to argue for no prison time, for some sort of home confinement or probation. Is there any chance of that? Or do you think the smart money is he will get some prison time?
Yeah, again, I hate to make this like a Vegas over-under, Paris, but I don't think there's any scenario under which Judge Kendall will give home confinement. He is 80 years old. He lists a litany of health issues. He has a powerful family story, adult children who need his help. But I can't imagine the judge, because again, on the other side, the judge will point out that there's defendants at the lower socioeconomic spectrum who don't have these great letters, who didn't have the chances, who didn't have the education, and I'm not giving them a break, so how can I possibly give you a break?
Certainly you can't argue that Burke was on the lower end of the spectrum in terms of power. I mean, he ran this city, you know, in so many ways for so long. And if you think about the Ryan and the Blagojevich cases, you know, it seems like there were more bombshell criminal activities done, or at least discussed. This, we're talking about getting, you know, business for his tax firm in exchange for favorable city action. Were you surprised at all by the outcome?
No, Paris, because of the tapes. You're right that the conduct was not completed. There wasn't acts that had money go into his pocket. But the way he talked about sort of government business being something that he was entitled to, I think that's what the jury heard, and I think that's why they convicted. It wasn't the conduct, it was the words. And I think that's what's ringing true. And again, the judge heard all this, and I think the way he spoke on tape, I think will be that was his undoing at trial, and I think that will be cause for a sentence that many will think is fairly harsh.
All right, well, we await that on Monday. That's going to be huge news coming up next week. Patrick Collins, thank you so much for being here.
Up next on Paris on Politics.
Is an 8 p.m. curfew what the doctor ordered to curb summer violence in the city?
He's an Illinois sports legend.
Where I come from, it's about basketball, it's about getting back to the game.
From a historic championship run.
Y'all ain't just teammates, y'all brothers.
To training the next generation of ballers.
What was it like being on Sports Illustrated, the Jersey Pop photo?
They should have put our whole team on there.
CYD Brown is Chicago built.
Not scared of nothing, love challenges.
Streaming now at Fox 32 on Fox Local. Search Fox Local on these streaming platforms.
This swag we have in Chicago is we do it the best.
Streeterville residents are on edge after a rash of recent violent crime incidents, most notably the assault of a young couple by teenagers 2 weeks ago. One alderman thinks he has the answer to help curb these incidents, an 8 p.m. curfew for teenagers unless they are accompanied by adults. But Mayor Brandon Johnson says a curfew is not the direction he wants to go.
If a young person has to be accompanied by an adult, what is the definition of an adult? Is it an 18-year-old? Is it a 19-year-old? Is it a 21-year-old? These are just reasonable questions. And, you know, if a child is downtown at 8:01 with an 18-year-old or a 19-year-old friend, does that count as the accompaniment?
And we are now joined by the sponsor of the ordinance, 2nd Ward Alderman Brian Hopkins. Alderman Hopkins, thanks for being here.
Thanks, Paris.
So under your ordinance, if an unaccompanied minor under 18 is out on the street past 8 p.m., what happens?
Well, the police are allowed to use their discretion, which is currently the case with the 10 p.m. curfew, and identify the ringleaders from within a large group of teenagers that have gathered and cite them for a curfew violation. They're allowed to pick them up, put them in the back of a police car, drive them to the nearest police station, and contact a parent or guardian or other responsible adult to come and get them.
So they wouldn't be arrested?
They're not arrested unless there's some other crime that happened in conjunction with the curfew violation. There's no fingerprinting, there's no handcuffing, there's no mugshots. They're simply removed from the streets, which is, they don't belong on the street if they're 14 years old and it's, 11 o'clock at night, and taken to a police station so a parent or guardian can take them home where they belong.
And moving the curfew from 10 p.m. to 8 p.m., 2 hours up, how would that help safety in Streeterville?
Well, in the example that you cited in Streeterville, that occurred about 9 p.m. And that was a large group of teenagers that started gathering around 7 p.m. So the police were monitoring them, watching them closely. They weren't really doing anything except, sort of generally acting like teenagers running up and down the sidewalk. And it wasn't until they got into that confrontation with the young couple at 9 p.m. that the crime occurred. But had the police had the ability to intervene more directly and prevent that group from getting larger and prevent them from getting out of control, which they ultimately did, we could have stopped that young couple from being attacked.
And you heard the concerns from Mayor Johnson, who constitutes an adult or a guardian, and why can't police just break up a crowd now?
Well, they can, as I mentioned, after 10 p.m. In fact, just this last weekend, we had about 20 curfew violations in Streeterville alone, where the 18th District police officers were trained what to look for. They identified the ringleaders, cited them for a curfew violation, removed them from the street in front of their peers, and that has a quelling impact on the remaining group. They see that happening, and they think to themselves, maybe we should disperse. The police are picking us up.
I think you told me last week it was the police that came to you and said that they really want this enacted. Is that true?
That is true. The 18th District in particular, it's a very effective tool that they're using to quell some of these large crowds and prevent them from growing. Again, these are, 13, 14, 15-year-olds who are, like any teenager, they don't have good impulse control, and they're out there looking for a thrill, looking for excitement. If the police have this tool that they can selectively use, it's the best thing that they can do to stop these crowds of young people from getting out of hand.
All right, so you see the mayor is opposed to this. You introduced the ordinance. It went to the Rules Committee, which colloquially among insiders is known as where legislation goes to die. It can get stuck there. So do you face an uphill battle here to get this passed?
I absolutely face an uphill battle. I'm realistic enough about my colleagues and their views, and I've talked to many of them. I don't have 26 votes to pass this as we have this conversation today, Paris. But I'm not going to stop. The debate has to happen. Even if I can't get this passed, I think we can shed a lot of light on this issue, bring some other ideas to the table. This issue deserves a hearing, and I believe that we will get one. The Rules Committee can refer it to possibly the Public Health Committee. My colleagues said they didn't want it in my committee, which I chair.
You're in the Police Committee.
I'm in the Public Safety Committee, and they felt that that would have been a little bit too much of a conflict of interest if I'm controlling the committee that is ostensibly having this hearing, to be fair. I agree with that. It doesn't have to be in my committee. I'm willing to send it to the Health Committee, but we really should have this public discussion, and we should consider the implications of what's happening right now with increasing violence downtown. We just had 3 people killed in the 31st Street beach this week alone. People being shot and murdered on the beach. I mean, seriously, we have a major problem with violence in this town right now, and we need to address it.
And I know that Streeterville residents have been addressing it in numerous public meetings recently. I want to turn to another issue that was in the news this week. Word leaked out that Donald Trump was going to stay at his hotel in the Trump Tower during the RNC instead of Milwaukee, and then the campaign said, no, we're going to stay in Milwaukee. It's your ward, as I understand. Were those serious plans being considered for him to stay here?
Yes, Trump Tower is just outside of my ward, but it is in my police district that, that I oversee as part of the 18th district. And I can confirm that they were not just thinking about spending the night at Trump Tower, they were planning to. And we took all necessary steps that we were asked to do to make sure the facility was secure, make sure that there would be contained protests if it happened, trying to block Wabash Street, which, wouldn't be the first time that happened. So we were ready for it. And then when the word leaked out, I think that in combination with Donald Trump's insulting remarks directed toward the host city of Milwaukee, the campaign staff realized they had to go into damage control mode and deny that they ever planned to stay in Chicago and announce that they were going to stay in Milwaukee. That's what campaigns do when there's a faux pas like that.
And it was going to be probably a public safety nightmare here. And as I understood, Trump was considering taking a helicopter up to Milwaukee. Lastly, today, Friday, you had a briefing from OEMC on the DNC security plans here in Chicago. What did you learn?
Yeah, we are ready. There's a multi-agency effort involved in this. What I learned today was the depth of all the different federal agencies that are actually participating in keeping the citizens of Chicago and Milwaukee, too, safe during their convention as well. We are much more sophisticated than we were back in 1968. Everyone talks about the comparison, of what happened during the protest era, in the Vietnam War. This is no comparison at all. The level of sophistication from the various enforcement agencies, public safety agencies, from the Secret Service on down, throughout the Justice Department. We have ATF, we have the FBI. It's just an alphabet soup of agencies that all have a small role to play in making sure that people can, in fact, exercise their First Amendment rights, but we're simply not going to allow chaos to take over the streets of Chicago, even though there will be anarchists here that want that to happen. Our job is to play that cat and mouse game and make sure it doesn't.
And Chicago no stranger to these big events where that element has shown up. Alderman Brian Hopkins, a lot on your plate. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Paris.
And that's all the time we have for this edition of Paris on Politics. Enjoy the summer weather this weekend. Enjoy Pride. And we'll see you next week. So long, everybody.
An inside look into Mayor Tiffany Henyard and the drama in Dalton. Streaming now at Fox 32 on Fox Local. Search Fox Local on these streaming platforms. Download and watch today.